It's an important sector for both a political economy perspective, but also on the broader issues of climate change. How do we decarbonize our way out? How do we provide the institutions that are going to not only decarbonize, but actually be in the public interest in the short, medium, and long term, both for consumers and for the industry that we need to power our economy.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and research director at the Broadbent Institute. Earlier this fall, the Alberta Federation of Labour released a new report entitled Power in the Public Interest, Re-regulation and Increased Public Ownership in Alberta's Electricity Sector. A headline from a press release of the report reads, Albertans have overpaid $24 billion for electricity since 2001. This is long before the interruptions and constraints caused by more recent inflation, or long before any carbon taxes were ever implemented in Canada. The report instead points to the province's deregulated power generation as the culprit behind this price gouging. This has become a huge problem in the province as Albertans, despite living in a so-called energy powerhouse, find their household affordability taking a major hit, while the electricity grid has become prone to reliability issues and failure, especially during cold snaps. Not to mention the other infrastructure issues that plague Alberta's cities, the report details how, despite consuming 2% of all electricity demand between the interconnected grids of Canada and the United States, the province accounts for 35% of emergency alerts when blackouts are imminent or in progress. Unique to Alberta, and the cause pointed to behind the lack of grid security is deregulation and privatization, which have led to high costs and poor service. Where have we heard this before? Edgardo Sepulveda, a regulatory economist and consultant, is the author of this new report from the AFL. He speaks to us now about what it will take to bring power back into the public interest in Alberta. Edgardo, thank you for joining us on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
You're welcome, Clement. Thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to our discussion.
So the story of weather events like minus 40-degree cold snaps, they're not unusual for Canadian winter. But in your report, Power in the Public Interest, Re-regulation and Increased Public Ownership in Alberta's Electricity Sector, there's this story where extreme weather events put pressure on Alberta's energy grid earlier in 2024, where the Alberta Electricity System Operator asked households to cut consumption or face blackouts despite the extreme cold alerts. It sounds to me a lot like the electricity grid crises that have been happening in the United States these past few years, like in 2021, there's a cold snap in Texas that triggered a grid failure, leaving millions without power and contributing to more than 200 deaths. How did we get to this point in the electricity sector where rolling blackouts threaten people's lives? And are other provincial grid systems at risk?
Excellent question. And the short answer is neoliberalism. One of the things that both Alberta and Texas share is that they have energy market and they're majority privatized. So in the context of the increasing commodification of many of our fundamental basic services, whether it be housing, whether it would be food security, whether it would be education and healthcare, and the attacks from the right on those basic functions in order to commodify them, take control away from the collective, from the social good, and move things away from the public interest, but towards the private interest, and more so the unregulated private interest. That's the diagnosis. The diagnosis is that we shouldn't be surprised that it is Alberta, of all of the provincial grids, even within the North American grid, that has suffered the most in terms of reliability, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, that it has the highest prices, astronomically high prices in 2022 and 2023. So if I had to put one word as to why this is the case, it's called neoliberalism. And so what this paper does is looks at it from a labor perspective, from a progressive social democratic perspective, and looks at the sector to look at the workings of why we shouldn't be surprised, in spite of all the market apologists, including within the government in Alberta right now, who say, oh, it is what it is. There is no alternative. Suck it up. There's nothing to be done. And so us on the left, been hearing about that since Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, or from my country in Chile under the dictatorship of Pinochet, there is no alternative. One of the motivating factors that I wanted personally as an author to write about this, and certainly on the AFL perspective, the Alberta Federation of Labor, was that we wanted to put forward an alternative, that there is an alternative, that there's different ways to do this. And more importantly, we have very much experience in Canada and even in Alberta previously of the ways things could be done and that there is a better alternative. And so we wanted to open up the policy discussion to propose in a very specific way based on evidence and data, first of all, that the neoliberal experiment of liberalization and deregulation has been a failure. And second of all, that there is an alternative.
Well, speaking of the alternatives, I think it's difficult to blame carbon taxes or whatever the Alberta government throws around these days across Canada with their propaganda you see on the hockey game out here in Ontario as the cause for their electricity issues in Alberta. You know, when all provinces across Canada pay the same in carbon taxes, they face the same national regulations. Still, you know, where you can find some of the highest prices for electricity in households in Canada, despite Alberta also being an energy producing province, why are Albertans then getting gouged at the meter for such poor performance, despite their reputation as an energy powerhouse?
I mean, in terms of the mechanisms via which the neoliberal vision was implemented in Alberta, you know, dates back to the late 1990s. Those of us who were active in the policy debates at the time, you know, this is the peak of neoliberal influence. And so people were cutting taxes, reducing welfare payments, and, you know, that across the macroeconomy. In the microeconomy, and specifically with sectors, that could be seen with the quite radical disruption of the electricity sector, where over 100 years, both in Canada and the United States and in Europe, there had always been a balance between private and public ownership. For those of us who remember, the important issue of ownership of the means of production is critical. So from a political economy perspective, there was a push on the right to counter the gains in the sector from a public ownership perspective. And so there was a big push for privatization. It occurred in Nova Scotia, for example, in the early 1990s, where Nova Scotia Power, which had been nationalized, which had been provincialized in the late 1960s, early 70s, there the Conservative government privatized it, and it was at the time the largest privatization in Canadian history, right? So that was 1990s. It happened here in my province of Ontario. There was, again, under the Conservative government, a move to dismantle Ontario Hydro and then sell it off. And in fact, it was finally sold off under the Liberal government of Hydro One. OPG remains a 100% publicly owned Crown corporation. And so in Alberta, the Conservative government of Ralph Klein, again, was influenced by the neoliberal wave at the time and the promises made by the designers of these markets, including Enron. Enron ultimately was involved in Alberta. They actually owned some of the capacity in the end, and were highly influential in basically making the intellectual case that markets are always better, and the more markets we should have, the better it'll be. And obviously, we know from Enron that, you know, ultimately there was a criminal intent to be able to financialize these markets, because that's the way in which they could make their money, by criminal withholding and other malfeasance that ultimately bankrupted Enron and, you know, ended up with a bunch of its CEOs and other people in jail. So there's a famous clause in Alberta that tripped up the NDP government there called the Enron clause that ended up in court. But again, this is the long process of, in the 1990s, what they did is they forced companies to separate their wires from their generation. So without getting too technical, there's basically two components in electricity. One is the wires that get your electricity into your home, into your business. That's distribution/transmission. And then you have the generation, which is the actual power generation. So whether that be a wind turbine in PEI, a nuclear plant here in Ontario, a big hydro dam in BC, that's the generation aspect. And so the vision that they had in Alberta was, let's create from scratch, let's design a market where the generation will be pooled across the entire province, and then we will have one single market clearing price, and that price will be applicable to all of the downstream segments, including the way in which a consumer would have to pay. And so the idea that you're creating from this stable, regulated monopoly to a quote-unquote free market, and the promise and we have this in paper because of all the consultation papers and announcements, the promise was lower prices, increased reliability. And what my paper does, which is a quantitative-based paper, was that in neither prices or reliability was the promise fulfilled. And so on its very own benchmark against which to measure, it has not delivered. And what we see, for example, is that Albertans, whether it be residential or commercial or agricultural or industrial users, have overpaid. We calculate $24 billion in prices since 2001, which is the advent of deregulation. So it's not a good tale, but it is a tale that is a warning to other provinces that it's not surprising that when you decommodify a basic service, it's not in the public interest. And that's one of the reasons that we named that, is that we think that the public interest is better served by the alternatives of a return to re-regulation and an increase in public ownership.
It sounds to me, with all of this history that you outline in the report, that Alberta is an outlier among other provinces, is the only unregulated electricity market in Canada. As you just alluded to, there's a lot of this neoliberal experiment that's been going on behind this, and it's applied to a small and concentrated market like Alberta. We have this situation that lends to a price gouging scenario, or as Isabella Weber, our 2024 Ellen Mixton's Wood lecturer, we bring out her ideas all the time in this past year just because they're so prescient. It's her main idea that she's referred to as seller's inflation. We see that experience happening now all the time in Alberta's electricity sector. How would re-regulation, perhaps, in Alberta reduce or at least make less variable or volatile electricity prices in the province?
That's exactly it. I mean, one of the prescriptions from Isabella and others, progressive economists, who make the case that much of the inflation, over the last 2 or 3 years was due to essentially the exertion of market power, right? In a concentrated market, whether it be groceries, right, the oil market, and other concentrated markets, is that the price increases was not as a result of, or was not mostly as a result of, the increasing price of the input costs, the input elements that have to be paid by producers, but rather the markup, right, which is the difference between their existing input costs and what they can charge as. That's the argument of seller's inflation. And certainly that's what we see in Alberta, in the electricity sector. What we have in Alberta is in 2021, 22, 23, was this confluence of, depending upon the way you look at it, if you're a seller, it's a very fortuitous confluence. If you're a buyer, it's a very bad for you. But basically what you have is that in an unregulated, privatized market, which is ultimately, let's think about it from this perspective, that it's kind of like capitalism on steroids, right? That's what the neoliberal vision was, is that unregulated, free market, privately driven markets, that's ultimately what these markets are, is highly cyclical. Right? Capitalism tends to cycles, boom and bust, and certainly the electricity market in Alberta is very much like that, in compared to other provinces which are highly planned, and they're not cyclical, and we see much more price stability. But what we see in Alberta was that as you go through the investment troughs, you have periods of overcapacity and undercapacity as a result of the dynamics of the market. So what we saw in Alberta was this period of undercapacity. So there wasn't enough. Markets were tight. There was also a return of what they're called the PPAs, which increased market concentration and therefore the possibility of the exertion of market power, price gouging. And so those two things combined with an exit of dispatchable resources and a series of other technical issues, a perfect storm where prices in Alberta spiked, right? Now, remember, what we're doing here is that the very prescription that Isabella Weber and Jim Stanford and other progressive economists are talking about to counter this seller's inflation are the very same institutions, political institutions, that were taken away voluntarily in Alberta. So the idea of a price cap, the idea of controlling profits, which are fundamental to the response to seller's inflation, are the very same tools that Albertans voluntarily gave away. And so the idea that we don't have the tools to do this, we actually do have the tools. And so that's the irony. The irony is that now we see seller's inflation everywhere. People are saying we don't have the tools to address them, or we don't have the right tools to address them. In the electricity sector around Canada, we actually do have the tools in most provinces, which is why you see lower and more stable prices, whether it be in Ontario, in BC, in Quebec. But in Alberta, they voluntarily gave those tools away in the pursuit of the neoliberal dream of that markets are always better and that markets will always deliver superior results.
What is to be done then to make electricity affordable and reliable in Alberta? You spoke about the other provinces there, and you still have above average prices in provinces like Ontario and Nova Scotia. Are there lessons here in Alberta that could also translate to affordable hydro rates elsewhere in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, look, we talked about Nova Scotia, right? We talked about how they used to have a publicly owned crown corporation, and the advantages of a public crown are many. One of the main ones is that they can borrow at lower interest rates than private companies. So in a highly capital intensive industry such as electricity, with very long lived assets, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years sometimes, you have to borrow a great deal because in order to be able to have a payback period that is consistent with the economic life of the asset, you have to borrow all the time. And so borrowing costs are a large component of your costs providing electricity. And so if you can have, half of your borrowing costs reduced as a result of being able to access capital markets, with the backing of a provincial government or a federal government, you're already way ahead. So that's one of the primary economic rationales for public ownership. And so we've seen in Nova Scotia how we have a privatized utility that was privatized very recently, 1991. And so the idea that, you want to re-provincialize it, return it to public ownership, the same way that it was done in 1971, right? So we go through the cycle in Nova Scotia where you have a private company for most of its history. 1971, 72, you have a Liberal government who nationalizes it, provincializes it. And then you have a provincial government in 1990s who privatizes it. But in Nova Scotia, it is not policy of any of the parties, the Liberals, the NDP, or the Conservatives. And we just had an election in Nova Scotia to bring it back to public ownership. The Nova Scotia NDP, for example, did not run this most recently on the returning of the Nova Scotia Power, Emera, to public ownership. And that's one of the challenges that we face on the left, which is that even within our own ranks, neoliberalism and the idea that compared to health or education, where we would be very much against the idea of increasing privatization, for some reason, the energy sector and the electricity sector, we kind of forget about that. And so whether it's, like in Nova Scotia, the NDP was in power in Alberta for 3 or 4 years, and their response to the electricity sector there was more market. Right? And so even within, nominally social democratic political parties, the idea that markets are actually better, that greater commodification is better, is at conflict with our traditional vision that we should actually decommodify basic goods. We should take them away from the private sphere and put them firmly under social control.
The experiences of regulated and public hydro utilities in Manitoba and British Columbia, which have some of the lowest household electricity rates in the world, that goes to show that public ownership is a solution for what looks like Alberta's high cost problems. But in particular, how would increased public ownership in Alberta help reduce electricity costs for everyday people in their homes? Like, are we looking at such a reduction to meet the needs of Alberta's industry as well as working families?
So, the electricity sector in Canada is quite different than the United States, for example, and much of Europe. There's a long tradition of political struggle for public ownership. So in 1902, for example, the first municipally owned electricity system utility was in Edmonton, right? It was even before Alberta became a province. It was still part of the Northwest Territories. And so basically, the municipal government at the time had signed a private franchise agreement with a private company for 10 years. And then when the franchise agreement was up, the private company wanted to continue that. And the city, in the support of its voters, said, no, we can do this better, cheaper, faster. And so in 1902, Edmonton Power became the first municipally owned utility company. That company continues to this day. It's now called EPCOR, and it is the publicly owned utility in the city of Edmonton. The same applies for Calgary. There, after 20 or 30 years of private ownership, the city decided, in support of its voters, to borrow money to buy out the assets of the private company, and hence it became Calgary Power, which then changed its name over the years, and now it's called ENMAX, right? So the same thing occurs in Medicine Hat, in Red Deer, and a series of other the large cities in Alberta. So Alberta's always had this mix of publicly owned municipal entities, and then at the generation end, mostly privately owned. So what we want to do, what our proposal, and again, by the way, these are decades-long processes. These are not things that happen from one day to the next. They're political processes that require political support, so therefore it has to be sustainable politically, right? For example, Hydro-Quebec, which is now 100% publicly owned, vertically integrated, that took the first part of the nationalization was in the Second World War, and it took about 25 years to integrate the rest of the province in Hydro-Quebec. It happened in Ontario. It's the same situation as Saskatchewan under Tommy Douglas. We don't expect that it will be a one day to the next. So there's going to be a two-step process in the mechanism via which we see an increase in public ownership in Alberta. One is to support the existing municipal utilities to expand and also help municipalities that are now served by private utilities that are unhappy with the service to municipalize, which is, the technical term for taking over the assets of a private company and taking them under public control. So that's one thing that we expect will be attractive, and it's usually done by public votes. Right? I mean, it's the way it was done in Ontario, it was the way it was done in Toronto and Quebec, etc. It's done on a political decision-making process where the government, based on the wishes of the constituents, say to the private owner, let's talk. We want to take over your assets. We think we can do better. How much are you expecting for compensation? Let's negotiate that process. And then, on the other hand, the government then borrows the money against which to purchase those assets. And then the borrowing is based on the future expected streams of revenues that come from the ownership of those assets. So these are productive revenue assets. So you're borrowing against that. And so you go either directly to the capital markets, or, as in the case of Alberta, like many other provincial governments, they have special financial windows whereby municipalities can borrow on relatively more favorable rates as guaranteed by the provincial government to, improve their infrastructure, whether it's be roads, sewers, and electricity. So that's one way that we see an organic, local democratic way in which what is already a vibrant, publicly owned municipal sector can increase in Alberta. The other stream is through the creation of a provincial crown corporation, such as BC Hydro, such as Saskatchewan Power, such as Hydro-Quebec. And then the creation of that legal entity would have two functions. First of all, as we all know, in the context of our decarbonization expectations and goals, electricity, not only in Alberta, but in much of the West and much of Canada, is expected to have to double or triple as we replace carbon-fueled energy services in our cars, for example, in our gas furnaces in our homes, with electricity. So if that's going to have to double, there's going to be significant growth and opportunity for organic growth for Alberta Power, this new, what I'm calling the new Crown Corporation, to supply a significant portion of incremental growth. So, for example, if the Alberta grid would have to double between now and 2050, looking only at incremental growth, if the Alberta Power could address 50% of that growth, so that's 50% of 50% is 25%. it could have 25% market share by 2050. So again, it's an issue of organic growth. We're not proposing a wholesale nationalization of the entire sector at this point. It's not necessary because we think that we can get much of the way there through the re-regulation, which is to say that you dismantle the wholesale market and you re-regulate again. You impose those price caps that Isabella Weber, for example, was talking about. And it's a return to what used to happen in 2001. You don't have to create a new institution for that because you already have the Alberta Utilities Commission that has never given up the regulation of the transmission and distribution segments. So again, we have the institutions, we have the history, we have the data to drive the decision-making process, and we have both the opportunity for organic growth and also on a smart way for acquisitions when private operators are no longer interested in providing service. We saw, for example, that right now the third largest operator was acquired by the first largest operator in a sort of friendly acquisition. So that operator, which is called Heartland, which had also been acquired 3 or 4 years ago, is now being acquired again, and so you can see even greater concentration in the Alberta market. That operator could have been acquired partially or fully by the Crown Corp because they were in the market. They were interested in selling. They were no longer interested in going to the energy market. And so you don't even have to have it forcibly done so. It's a voluntary process. But we didn't have the political mechanisms and institutions at the time to be able to take advantage of that acquisition opportunity. So what we're proposing is an Alberta Power that does two things. When there's an opportunity for acquisition, you do so, and if it makes sense, at the right price, which is the way in which most crown corporations expanded in Canada. And two, you take advantage of the proposed organic growth, and you take a chunk of that process to grow the size and expertise of the crown corporation. So that in 25 years, in 30 years, we would see a different, more balanced public and private mix that actually works quite well. The public is kept on its toes to make sure that it is efficient as a result of competition from the private perspective. And the private perspective and private owners are kept on their toes because if they don't perform well, citizens will vote to acquire their assets. And so that's the way they're kept. That's what's called benchmark competition. It was designed and it was something that was trumpeted by Roosevelt in the 1930s and 40s to ensure that this mix is sufficient to be able to provide effective competition for the market.
Now, just lastly, should Albertans be thinking about a supergrid? Should Canadians be thinking about a supergrid as something maybe of a nation-building project that brings these disparate provincial electricity grids and companies together, these crown corporations together, in order to power renewable electricity generation across the country?
I mean, I think it's an interesting idea. I've seen some of the modeling that occurs, but I am concerned that, and again, this is not part of the report, but from a sort of personal perspective, I'm a little concerned about the institutional and political mechanisms that would be required to make this work. So what do I mean by that? The neoliberal vision is to create markets that are beyond political control, beyond social control. And so they have been successful in a number of instances. And one of the visions of that was to create supergrids. So the idea of a supergrid has a technical component and has a political component. The technical component is that if you can take advantage of different resources, why not? Why can't we trade? Right? Like it's the gains from trade. As a social democrat, I'm a little concerned about the promise of the public interest and public good coming from increased trade, not because increased trade is necessarily a bad thing. We would trade regardless. What concerns me is the mechanisms via which that trade would take place. And what we see in the United States, what we see in Europe are, continental-wide networks that are driven by a neoliberal vision of no state intervention, no social control, and where the decisions about investment, about trade, are done by private actors and ultimately through the financialization of the sector, which is why so many people are interested in the financialization of the sector. We have a huge industry in Alberta that basically buys wholesale electricity and then sells it on a retail level as resellers. And so there's a whole industry of doing that. And so traders will always want larger markets because there's more advantage and more potential for arbitrage for that. So the way in which supergrids have actually done in practice, whether it's the large, transmission organizations in the United States or the ISOs, the system operators, is that it's been done based on a neoliberal vision of markets, of limited social control, of trading. And so it's not done in the context of a public interest. And so a lot of people who are not familiar with the way in which these things are done in practice and then the vision and institutions that are promoted under such a vision technically are attracted by the idea of a grid, of a super grid. But, I am concerned about the way in which that would be done. You would also, as we know, this is a federal country. And so electricity and energy resources are under the purview of the provinces. And so you don't only have to have Alberta agreeing to this, you'd have to have Saskatchewan agreeing to it and BC. And so I don't see that politically, and I don't think it would necessarily be in the public interest if it was to be applied under this neoliberal vision. So that's one thing. And I think if our challenge is, if a diagnosis of the report is that the increasing commodification of markets and privatization in the electricity sector has not been a net benefit. It's not been in the public interest in Alberta. The idea that we can somehow avoid that same result on a regional perspective, I think is probably not the right assessment. I think a regional market would see traders benefit, private enterprise benefit, but I don't think it would be in the public interest.
Edgardo, thank you for this very enriching, very interesting conversation on electricity sector and neoliberalism. Thank you again for joining us on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thank you, Clement.
That was Edgardo Sepulveda, regulatory economist and consultant, and author of Power in the Public Interest, Re-Regulation and Increased Public Ownership in Alberta's Electricity Sector from the Alberta Federation of Labour. And if you like this interview, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca.